I picked up this old oak desk from the school I work at. It had seen years and years of use and abuse, and my superintendent said I could take it home because they just wanted to get rid of it. It's been sitting in my shop for a couple years, and I've been waiting for the right project to come along. I start by ripping these boards down to 9.5 inch wide. I wanted to maximize the material for this. So I had really taken my time measuring and remeasuring before ever making a single cut so that I could get the most out of these two boards. Here I am gluing up one of the boards that was 3.5 and the other one was 6 inches. And these were going to be the other 3 shelves for the unit. Here I am actually using a jig to cut out an angled piece. I had determined the angle of the sides that I had wanted to use and use this jig to cut these pieces out so I could make another jig. So after cutting those angled pieces off to the right size, I glued them onto this piece of 1/2 inch plywood. And I will be using this jig or this angled piece throughout the rest of the build. You can see how I built a little frame around it for the router, and I needed to use this so that I could router out the mortise at an angle. I'm making through mortises here in order to accommodate the angle of the sides. I needed this angle. It was kind of scary doing this the first time. Scary only because I didn't want to mess it up. But it all worked pretty well. Here's a close-up of that cut. Go around once and then plunge a little deeper and then cut some more. So after I had those mortises cut, then I ran these 3/4 inch boards across just so I could get an indication of the lengths I was going to need. So I made sure the angles were correct, and then I could transcribe my lines here so I knew where to cut. And then I marked, I believe it was 1.5 inches. I think it was 1.5 inches. I went past the boards here. And then you can see I've got that jig here again on my crosscut sled. And I'm using it to cut the angled cuts on the shelves. You can see I used this little stick here kind of as a clamp, pushed it on the back of the jig, then pushed it up onto the shelf, and then clamped the other side. That way I could have my hands well away from that spinning blade. And then I had to move it over to the other side once I made half the cuts. So I'd put it in there, found out where I needed it, and then I put this little stop block so I could get repeatable cuts. Again, clamping it in before I made the cuts. And then I took off that angle jig so that I could make the 2 end cuts. And I was a little short with the size of the blade, so I had to finish up the cuts with a handsaw. And in actuality, I think I probably could have got just as accurate with if I had a better saw, I think I could have got just as good results. And here I'm rounding over this just using a file. Nothing else that I could think of would work better here. So I just use a file, and you can get pretty good results if you take your time and be careful. So here is kind of a big event in the project because I get to see how well I did my cuts. So put the 4 shelves in on one side, then took the other side and carefully pushed the tenons through the mortise. So the first sneak peek of what this thing's going to look like. Then I was able to make some marks because I needed to cut some holes here, get some more mortises for a wedge to fit in. So again, another jig was needed. You can see what I came up with here. Just able to slide the board in with that mortise sitting there. And then I clamp another board on the back end just so that it can't move while I'm making my cuts. And I use those boards as the boundaries of where my router needed to go. Then I needed to make the wedges, so I had this leftover piece of oak from the build, so I used it to make the wedges. Cut them on the bandsaw and then sanded them up later. And they go in just like that. At this point I looked at it and I thought it looked too boxy on the end, so I decided to cut off just a little bit on each side at an angle, kind of tapered it, and I just came in I think 7/8 of an inch on the top on both sides. So you can see it started flush on the bottom, and when I finish this cut it's about a 7/8 of an inch in from the edge there. And then of course I had to trim off the shelves then to compensate for that difference in width then. Then I used a round over bit on all the exposed edges. And of course, everybody's favorite job of sanding. I needed to change that bag. I did that shortly after I started here. But I used a 60 grit sandpaper there. It really took off that finish quickly. And it exposed this crack in here. I didn't realize it was actually in there until I sanded. So basically I had to take care of this. So I grabbed a couple of screwdrivers and I shoved them in there. The crack wasn't all the way through, but it was about 90% through. So I used these screwdrivers as wedges to pry open that crack even more so I could actually bust it out. And then I glued it back together and clamped it. That way I knew it wouldn't fail later on. And then I could get back to the job of sanding. I used 120 grit and then even 220 grit at the end. I used a Danish oil here. It's a cherry color, and I really liked that I used it because it's got a nice red color in there, and since this is red oak that I was using, I thought it really brought out a nice rich color in this oak. So here's the final product. I really like the look of those through mortise and tenon joints with the wedges. And I left a little bit of the scratches from the abuse of the table. I thought it turned out nice. Thanks for watching. I appreciate the support.